The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, there's a serious question as to whether this legislation will help or hurt actually balancing the budget. At some point, we've got to stop talking about process and actually get to balancing the budget, but unfortunately, many people have run on platforms that violate fundamental principles of arithmetic. They're promising all these tax cuts and not sufficient spending cuts to come anywhere close. Now, my suggestion has been that we let all the Bush-era tax cuts expire. That'll give us as much deficit reduction as anything on the table. I recognize that that's unpopular, but when we start cutting Social Security and Medicare in order to preserve those tax cuts, I believe that position is going to get a lot more popular. Now, we've been talking about this balanced budget amendment and talking about all these states that have balanced budget amendments. A gentleman from Arizona has acknowledged that his state, Arizona, received $6.4 billion in stimulus money, $1,000 for every man, woman, and child, $4,000 for a family of 4. Even after that, they had to sell the state capitol building for $735 million, then sold the Supreme Court building for another $300 million in order to help balance their budget. We keep talking about some kind of restraint and some kind of balanced budget or a balanced budget amendment. As the gentleman from Michigan has indicated, we don't vote on some kind. We have to vote on HJ-Res 1 and ascertain whether that's going to help or hurt. Now, Governor Thornburg, you indicated that you need some glide path to balance, and you recognize that HJ-Res 1 doesn't have any glide path. You recognize that. You talked about your balanced budget. You recognize that even the Republican study group budget that balances in 2020 requires a 3/5 vote because it's not balanced this year. An irresponsible budget requires 3/5 vote. Does your Pennsylvania legislature require a 3/5 vote to pass a budget?
No.
You can cut taxes on a simple majority under this amendment, but it would take 2/3 vote to repeal a tax cut or to raise taxes. Does your constitutional amendment require a 2/3 vote to raise taxes?
I don't have a constitutional amendment.
In Pennsylvania.
Oh, the Constitution? No.
In Pennsylvania. It doesn't.
This
legislation has a war exception. If you were governor and called out the National Guard, could you run an unbalanced budget? No. There's no war exception in your constitutional amendment, is there not?
We have no power to declare war.
Okay. You've indicated you have a capital budget, so you can in fact borrow money.
Yeah.
Exactly what provision in HJ-Res 1 do you think would be helpful to actually balance the budget other than the title?
As I indicated, I have not studied the details of this. My message...
Provision. What provision in HJ-Res 1, can you name one that actually help balance the budget?
The provision that I would
other than the
most
title
strongly support is one that requires a matching of revenues and expenditures.
Also
has a separate capital budgeting requirement.
Okay, that's not in HJ-Res 1. You're talking about things that are not in HJ-Res 1.
I didn't understand that I was asked here to talk about a specific piece of legislation. This was more devoted.
We're just getting your testimony straight. Professor Joyce, the provisions in the bill, a 3/5 vote, which would cover the Republican study group and an irresponsible budget. Would that provision help or hurt balance the budget?
It would hurt.
The 2/3 vote to raise taxes, would that help or hurt balance the budget?
It would hurt.
The 2/3 vote to spend more than 18% of GDP, you'll notice you can cut Social Security and Medicare and Social Security with a simple majority, but to save it with taxes would require a 2/3 vote. What effect would that have on Social Security and Medicare?
Well, I think the obvious effect it would have on Social Security and Medicare, because of demographics and because of health care inflation, those programs are projected to continue to rise. 18% of GDP is 3% lower than the 40-year historical average. The 40-year historical average is not going to be sufficient to allow for that growth, so it would clearly have an effect of requiring cuts in those programs.
Now, are you aware of, let me ask Professor Dr. Holtz-Eakin, in 2001, when your administration came in, you weren't there, But when that administration came in, the fiscal challenge was that we were running so much of a surplus that we were paying off the national debt too quickly. What happened?
I think it's pretty clear that in retrospect, a big part of the revenue surge in the late 1990s was driven by the dot-com bubble, that we had a bubble burst. We know the economic consequences were a recession. We know the budgetary consequences were enormous drop-offs in revenues. It was also the case that we benefited in the 90s from the decline of the Soviet Union, and we had a peace dividend that everyone acknowledged made it much easier to hit spending caps, which were imposed. That reversed with the advent of the events of September 11, 2001.
From 2001.
Time of the gentleman has
Can I
expired.
have 30 more seconds, Mr. Chairman?
Without objection, gentleman's
From the
recognized for 30 additional
2001
seconds.
projection of a $5.5 trillion surplus to what it ended up, a $3 or $4 trillion deficit, a swing of about $9 trillion, how much of that was attributable to the war? $1 trillion. I yield
The
back,
war
Mr. Chairman.
in Iraq cost well over $1 trillion. I don't know the numbers for
$1 trillion. $9 trillion deterioration, $1 trillion attributable to the war. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.